This is Amelia from Amelia Voice, and today I'll tell you a story that will make your heart ache and your soul burn for justice. Listen closely because what follows is a slow, careful unmasking of cruelty hidden behind sisterly smiles, a betrayal measured in hospital bills and broken promises, and a revenge that tastes like cold coffee at 3 a.m. when you finally stop pretending you're asleep. I grew up thinking our family was simple, that love was a steady current that carried us through scraped knees and failed exams, that my sister Lena and I were two halves of a stubborn coin, different but inevitable companions. She had the laugh that made our mother cry with pride and the way of leaning into the room like she owned every small mercy. I, the practical one, learned to read charts and steady trembling hands. Nursing became my skin. Years later, the truth of who we were settled in like an infection I couldn't scrub away. Lena learned to play grief like a violin, and our parents paid the price. It started with small things, a cough here, a dizzy spell there, each emergency breathless and dramatic, each doctor's note a tiny fortress, and our parents, devout to their daughters, wrote checks as if they were signing prayers. Then the numbers sharpened into a shape you couldn't ignore. 30,000, 40,000, an eventual demand for 50,000 to cobble together experimental treatment and emergency transport, a figure that pushed our parents into secret savings. Whispered loans, futures pawned to keep a carefully curated sorrow alive. I watched the receipts pile like accusations on the kitchen table and swallowed questions until one night, when the smell of antiseptic followed me into bed, and I realized with a jolt that my hospital, the one I had bled for, had a patient whose chart bore my sister's name. She had checked into my floor under a different name at first, with symptoms staged as vaguely heroic, fatigue, syncope, a need for immediate attention. And the nurses on my team were kind and dutiful and painfully ignorant of the private ledger our family had been balancing. I could have walked away, signed my schedule, and gone home to watch our father cry into his hands as he read yet another bank statement. But that would have been a coward's complicity. I went to work. When Lena recognized me in the corridor, the smile on her face cracked like cheap porcelain. She didn't expect the steady calm that nurses learn under pressure. She expected hysterics, a flurry of family drama she could direct with practiced gestures. Instead, she found me in scrubs, a clipboard balanced in my hand, my badge reflecting fluorescent light. Her eyes said the things she had been counting on for years, that I would be hers to command, that I would be the gullible sister who smoothed her performance. But by then I had watched my parents' savings shrink and my father's shoulders stoop like an old coat. I had sat through bank meetings and loan officers' speeches cloaked in sympathy. I had seen our mother wake in the night and press a hand to her chest, as if to steady the tremor of betrayal she could not name. The hospital, with its neutral beeping and clinical rituals, became my theater of truth. I watched Lena play patient, the practiced pallor, the strategic tears, the way she coughed when the doctor entered, and then brightened at each sympathetic phrase as if applause were an oxygen mask. Nurses who had floated through her bedside told stories of her philanthropic voice, how she coaxed donations out of strangers, how she could make pity feel like a favor. It was disgusting and magnetic, the way she weaponized sympathy. I started documenting small inconsistencies, medication schedules that didn't match her supposed symptoms, empty vials where there should have been evidence of treatment, a social worker's file with names that didn't line up. I didn't expose her immediately. Revenge, I had learned, required patience and the slow accumulation of proof. What I did instead was place myself at the center of her web, listening as she manipulated doctors into extending her stay, bending bureaucratic rules with a smile, sending covertly filmed voicemails to my parents that I later played back with remorseless clarity. Each message was an area of suffering, each plea for funds another stroke of the saw that would sever our parents' stability. I recorded the patterns, the nights her pain coincided with us withdrawing money, the way she used our mother's devotion like a ledger, checking off sympathy as if it were currency. You will think I became cruel. You will think a nurse's oath and a sister's blood would have kept me from turning evidence into ammunition. But there is a point where betrayal becomes a moral wound and revenge, to those left bleeding, becomes an act of justice. I planned not to ruin her with spectacle, but to reveal her so completely that the truth would be irreversible. I arranged for a family visit that felt like reconciliation. Our mother's hands in mine, our father's throat thick and quiet, Lena radiant in the role she had written for herself. I brought photographs, not of her illness, but of the other faces she had worn, messages timed and saved, bank transfers printed and highlighted like veins. I watched as my mother tried to stitch explanations from fragments, as my father's eyes searched for some hidden kindness behind the numbers. Lena's face flickered through expressions so fast you could have mistaken it for weather. Surprised, then charming, then angry, then ingenuous as if she were improvising offstage notes when the music faltered. I let her speak first because liars love to set a cadence. She offered a rehearsed litany of sacrifices, of doctors who had misdiagnosed, of miscommunications and desperate appeals. My mother reached for her as if to believe. My father's hands gripped the arm of his chair like someone holding on to a sinking boat. Then I played the messages. I played the voicemail where Lena, breathless with calculated vulnerability, begged for a wire transfer to secure the consultant. The email where she asked a friend on social media to donate toward the cause, while secretly pocketing the funds. The video where she laughed about how convinced our parents were. Laughter that snapped our mother's jaw shut with the force of betrayal. The room turned colder than medicine, Lena argued, at first with the same theatrical flair she used on strangers, then with small helplessness as the walls she had built crumbled. My father's face, the map of his life, folded inward. There was a sound in the house that night like a cupboard door slamming on childhood. Lena moved to leave, and my mother reached toward her and then retracted her hand, as if stunned by the revelation that the thing she had been tending to was, in fact, a calculated fraud. You will want to know if I rejoiced. At that moment, there was no joy. Only the hollow relief that comes after a long, bitter fever breaks. I felt the gravity of what I had done. I had exposed my sister. I had taken away the scaffolding of sympathy she had been propping herself on for years. But I also felt something else, a terrible exhilaration at seeing truth unmasked. The revenge I delivered that night was not a scream, but a meticulous correction. I gave my parents the evidence they needed to stop paying, to reclaim their lives. That was the first cut. The weeks that followed were a slow unspooling. Lena was gone from our house. She had moved between cheap hotels and the pity of acquaintances who preferred not to ask questions. She called once, her voice hollow and small, accusing me of having no compassion, of violating sacred family bonds. I answered with a soft voice and facts, because cruelty often finds refuge in language. My parents, wounded and furious and grieving their own gullibility, began to repair their finances with a resolute, quiet fury. They went to banks, filed reports, and demanded refunds where possible. They spoke to lawyers who recommended measured steps instead of headline-making vengeance. I told myself this was enough, that exposing her was a moral realignment, that the scales would tip back toward some semblance of honesty. But Lena's betrayal had not been merely financial. It had been a theft of truth, and proving the theft didn't erase the scar. She retaliated, as people who have nothing left tend to do. She spread slander, whispered to old friends that I had orchestrated the exposure to inherit some imagined advantage. She leaked private family photos to tabloids with captions that turned me into the villain in her narrative. People love a neat story, the evil sister, the saintly victim, and Lena knew how to sell herself. There were nights I would leave work shaking, because a patient's family member would look at me and I would see distrust, as if the family drama had become a contagious rumor that could reach across hospital corridors. I began to understand that justice was not a single act, but a vigilance. It required me to keep showing up, to keep documenting, to keep my hand steady when everyone else wanted to shout. I leaned on my professional ethics, reporting the falsified records, cooperating with internal audits, and ensuring Lena could not pull similar cons on anyone else who trusted her. In doing so, I became the enemy in her stories. But I also became the person who made certain that others would not be robbed of their savings with the same smile. Revenge, I learned, is not always the thunderclap you dream of. Sometimes it is the patient tide that reveals what lay hidden beneath. I methodically worked with the hospital's compliance team to trace the anomalies, to document the times Lena's appointments coincided with suspicious transfers to third-party accounts, to present a pattern that left no room for plausible deniability. I testified, not with vengeful joy, but with the calm precision of someone who had watched harm happen and chose to act. Lena's world narrowed after that. It's humbling, seeing a once proud person reduced to legal counsel and angry texts and the small, pathetic pleas of someone begging the world to let them still be loved. She attempted to build new audiences, to find new marks, but reputation is a brittle thing once it is cracked. Friends who had been complicit in silence began to distance themselves when subpoenas came calling. Lovers who enjoyed her performance discovered the script behind the show. Justice in our case did not arrive as a single verdict, but as an accumulation of consequences, restitution orders where possible, a public unraveling of the trust she had built, an insistence from our parents that change would be long and cautious. The ache of what she had done lingered, a constant background of grief, but it was tempered by a slow-growing sense of rightness. My revenge, if I am allowed to call it that, was to ensure that she could not ever again weaponize our family's love for personal gain. It was also to reclaim my own story. I had been a nurse and a sister, not an accessory to her schemes. There are nights when I walk the hospital halls and imagine a different ending. One where Lena collapses at my feet and asks for forgiveness that looks like action, not theater. I have thought of confronting her in the cold light of a rainy afternoon, of saying every line that has stayed in my throat for months. But I also know that a violent reveal would only satisfy curiosity, not heal the wound. Instead, I keep my life in the slow, steady work of care, administering meds, holding hands through seizures, telling a frightened son that his mother will be okay. These acts are my quiet revenge on the idea that I could be manipulated. They are an insistence that compassion not be confused with gullibility. Sometimes our parents call and ask about Lena as if they are mourning two losses, the loss of money and the loss of the child they thought they knew. We speak carefully, with the bruised civility of people who have been burned but refuse to burn back. Lena's name is no longer a currency in our house. She tried to make money out of our parents' love, and she failed because love, when examined, is stubbornly truthful. It resists being bought for long. I will tell you this. Revenge changed me, but not into what I feared. It made me sharper, yes, more certain of boundaries. It made me understand that mercy, without an armor of discernment, becomes an invitation. If you ever find yourself on the edge of forgiving to keep peace, remember that some peace is bought with the coin of compromise that will always cost you more later. Forgive, certainly, but not without eyes open. And yet the last twist is that Lena did not vanish entirely. She resurfaced one autumn with a letter that smelled faintly of perfume and regret. It was not an apology, apologies should be plain and short, but a confession wrapped in a long, winding saga of why she had become what she became. Childhood resentments turned venomous. A hunger for attention that felt like oxygen. The belief that the world would only validate her if she made them believe in her suffering. In the margins of that letter, she asked not for money but for understanding, for a reconciliation that would not require her to fix what she had broken. I folded the letter carefully and put it in a drawer. I did not toss it. Some parts of me still wanted to believe in the sister who once braided my hair, but I also could not pretend that the past could be unmade with a few words. The revenge you crave when betrayed is often less satisfying than the slow, patient work of rebuilding what was stolen. Trust, financial security, a home unshadowed by calculation. So I continued to do my job, to be the person my patients needed, and to be, in my private moments, the daughter my parents deserved. Maybe my revenge had been delivered in the form of truth, blunt, careful, and final. Maybe the wound would heal, and we would find a way to be family, different and scarred, but honest. Or maybe Lena would remain distant, Forever a cautionary tale about the cost of faking a life that never belonged to you. Either way, I learned that love without boundaries is not love at all, and that sometimes saving your family means being the one to carry the burden of truth, even when it breaks you a little. I thought exposing Lena to our parents would be the end, but it was only the opening incision. Beneath the skin of family drama, there were arteries of fraud pulsing with quiet confidence, and I realized that if I didn't cauterize them properly, the whole thing would keep bleeding into other people's lives. At work, I became someone with a split sight line, one eye on my patients, the other on a paper trail that didn't want to be found. On the night shift, in that humming blue hour when monitors blink like stars and the floors smell faintly of lemon and bleach, I opened her chart as any head nurse might to ensure continuity of care, except my hands were colder than usual. The labs were inconsistent in a way that didn't scream. It whispered, elevated markers with no clinical correlation, reported episodes with no telemetry capture, medications ordered at convenient times that aligned perfectly with her dramatic calls home. She had even charmed a float doctor into signing a compassionate use form for a drug she never actually received. The barcode scans told the truth, and truth in hospitals is traced by beeps. One by one, I mapped the inconsistencies, timestamps, signature IDs, the suspicious lost IV that justified an extra bag build but never hung, and I built a timeline that would survive scrutiny. You can't walk into an ethics committee with anger. You walk in with receipts. So I documented everything, including how she scheduled social posts from her room. Yes, the hospital Wi-Fi logs gave me that little miracle. How donations spiked after each crisis, and how she nudged a kind-hearted volunteer into starting a GoFundMe with a picture of her looking like a saint smothered by sorrow. I didn't relish finding these things. Each discovery was a bruise I had to press, a reminder that my sister knew a hospital's compassion protocols better than most interns. When I finally requested a quiet meeting with compliance, they listened the way surgeons do when they're deciding whether the wound needs exploration. No judgment, just sharp questions. I laid out the charting anomalies and the financial echoes, and I used words I hated using about my own blood: malingering, misrepresentation, inducement. The room went still in that particular administrative way, and policy began to march. Lena sensed the shift before any letter reached her. She showed up at the nurse's station in an oversized sweater and eyes that could weep on command, asking for me like a child looking for her mother in a crowded mall. "I just want to talk," she said, voice soft enough to float. But when we stepped into a family room, the softness sharpened like a blade. She accused me of ruining her life, of choosing strangers over family, of wearing my scrubs like a weapon. I stood there, thinking of our mother's thin wrists and our father's mortgage statements, and I knew that letting Lena make the narrative would be my final mistake. I told her, in the same tone I used to explain a procedure to a terrified patient, that the hospital had standards designed to protect the suffering, not to platform performers. I told her that the investigation would be thorough and fair, that I had recused myself where appropriate and submitted everything through proper channels, that there were logs and audits that lived outside both of us. Her face went through its practiced weather. Then she said the quiet part out loud. "Do you realize how easy it is to make a good person look cruel?" She tilted her head, almost curious, as if she were observing a lab rat. She threatened to file harassment claims against me, to tell anyone who would listen that I had abused my access, that I had mined her vulnerabilities for revenge. For a heartbeat, I felt the floor tilt under me, because this was her superpower. The way she made righteousness feel like a sin, and then the training that had carried me through codes and courtroom depositions clicked in. I recited exactly when and why I had accessed her records, who had signed off on each view, and how my every move had been mirrored to a compliance monitor that would show no deviation. She blinked. The door, for the first time, was not hers to open. When she realized she couldn't frighten me, she pivoted to charm, asking me to look the other way, just this once, to let her exit quietly so our parents wouldn't have to relive the humiliation. "You can be the hero," she whispered. "You can save everyone the mess." It was almost flawless, that line. But I had seen the mess, the overdrafts, the pawned wedding bands, the sleepless nights, and I understood that the only cleanup left was disinfectant level honest. The hospital's internal machinery began to chew, a temporary hold on her billing, a note that future appointments would require prior authorization, a scheduled ethics hearing where interested parties would present facts. I didn't plan to attend the hearing, conflict of interest and all, but then a compliance officer asked me to submit a recorded statement, and I sat in a tiny office staring at a red light while I described how a sister can become a stranger when money is the oxygen in the room. Outside the system, the fallout grew feral. Lena posted a gauzy backlit video explaining that she was being persecuted by someone close, that jealousy can wear a uniform, and the comments spiraled into the usual fever of internet righteousness. I watched my phone light up with names I hadn't seen since high school. People asking if I had really turned on family for clout, and for a minute I tasted the metallic afterburn of rage. So I did something radical. I stayed silent publicly and doubled down privately. I took our parents to a financial counselor who specialized in post-fraud triage, a woman who spoke in gentle numbers and actionable steps. We froze accounts that had become porous. We set up alerts. We rerouted what could be rerouted. And our father changed the passcode on his phone with a trembling thumb that finally steadied. Meanwhile, a detective called, not with handcuffs but with curiosity. Had we noticed any patterns involving third-party donation coordinators? Were we aware of a cluster of cases at nearby clinics where patients mysteriously canceled procedures after funds disappeared into consultation fees? My stomach sank. Lena wasn't an anomaly. She was an early adopter. I knew then that stopping her wasn't just a mercy for our parents. It was a firewall for strangers she'd never meet. So I reached out to two people whose names appeared in her messages, an ex-friend who had orchestrated fundraisers, and a former roommate who had once texted, "Please stop making me the bad guy," after refusing to co-sign a loan. The ex-friend answered with caps lock fury, insisting she too had been manipulated. The roommate sent screenshots so jaw-dropping they felt like fiction. Draft doctor's notes in Notes app typography. Practice scripts for phone calls. A list labeled donor tiers with perks like VIP health updates, as if a human disaster were a loyalty program. I handed it all to the detective and to compliance, and then I sat with my parents at our kitchen table where 3 cups of cooling tea looked like a crime scene of ordinary life. And I told them it might get worse before it got better. They nodded with the haunted gratitude of people who know the truth is expensive but cheaper than the alternative. Night stretched into a taut wire. Anonymous numbers called. Whispers at work felt colder than the AC. I kept showing up anyway, because vengeance that requires you to abandon yourself is just self-harm with better music. In quieter moments between med passes and charting, I let grief pass through me like weather. Grief for the sister I had loved, for the childhood we had shared, for the version of me that believed all wounds could be sutured if held together long enough. And then the day of the ethics hearing arrived, and with it an email, neutral, bureaucratic, ominously bland, confirming that additional testimony had been submitted under my name that I had not written. Someone had tried to forge a statement that exonerated Lena and implicated me. My pulse spiked. My hands trembled for the first time in weeks. I called compliance and said the words slowly so they would land. That is not mine. They promised a forensic check, a chain of custody audit, an investigation into who had access to my files. I hung up and stared at my reflection in a medication room window, and I felt the old panic try to take the wheel. But panic is a bad driver. I squared my shoulders, because if Lena's final act was to repaint me as the villain with my own brush, then my counterstroke would be simple and devastating. I would bring the one thing she never thought I would dare to use, the patient she hurt worst when she lied. And as I dialed a number I had been avoiding, the number of a woman who had postponed real treatment to funnel cash into my sister's fantasy, I heard the click of the line opening and knew the next words would either end this or set it on fire. I called her, with a hand that didn't want to shake, the woman who had nearly sold her own surgery to my sister's cause. She answered on the second ring, surprised and wary, and when I told her my name, she went quiet as if she had recognized the shape of consequence on the line. I spoke gently at first, because people who have been used often respond better to kindness than to accusation. I reminded her of the afternoons she had sat at our kitchen table with my mother, pouring tea and promises, of how she had deferred her own appointment because she felt obligated to help Lena secure funding. Then I told her the truth, because I had learned that half-truths are the currency of manipulators. I told her that Lena had been living on sympathy thinner than tissue, that donations had been rerouted to phantom consults, and that the hospital had logs proving the posts, the calls, the timing. The woman wept, first into the receiver, and then into her sleeves, when she admitted she had been persuaded to start a fundraiser and had even signed an online petition that funneled money into accounts she hadn't audited. Her voice, piled with regret, became a crucial witness. The detective and I met with her in a coffee shop that smelled of burnt beans and second chances. She slid me crumpled screenshots and messages that read like a ledger of manipulation. Offers to split funds, instructions on what phrasing would pull hearts like levers, a spreadsheet of donors with suggested updates so they would keep giving. Every item she produced was another brick in a dam that had finally started to crack. I took them to compliance, to the detective, and into depositions where lawyers with encyclopedic patience asked me to recount things I had lived through, as if they belonged to someone else. My mother's trembling voice, asking whether it was all my fault. The look on our father's face when he learned their retirement had been drained into someone else's performance. I told the truth carefully, because I wanted the legal scaffolding to support what my conscience and my evidence demanded. Lena watched all this from the periphery, texting, posting, trying to spin narratives about betrayal and jealousy. And the more she tried, the smaller her audience grew. People like a villain with edges. They don't much care for complicated villains who are also their neighbor. The morning the detective handed me the arrest affidavit, my throat closed in a way that felt strangely like release and like mourning at once. It listed counts that were dryly clinical: fraud, impersonation, theft by deception. But behind the legalese were the faces of those who had been taken. A retiree who could not pay for a needed hip replacement. A teacher who had given a month's pay for updates she never received. My own parents whose credit lines had been stretched into ruin. The arrest itself was anticlimactic, a folding chair kind of theater. Lena at a diner wiping crumbs from her lips. A pair of officers speaking in neutral tones, and then handcuffs that she tried to smile out of as if charm could tangle steel. She mouthed something to the cameras about me being vindictive, and I felt, not joy, but a slow electric fatigue. The legal process that followed was a grinding human thing. Hearings that leaked into our daily life like a slow gray tide. Each witness, each clip of a voicemail, each bank transfer plotted on a screen felt like scraping away a layer of varnish to reveal the raw wood beneath. Lena's supporters dwindled as subpoenas came. Some saw the pattern, others just saw the consequences of being entangled with someone they hadn't fully known. At one hearing, a woman stood and told the court how she had sold a ring to help Lena get through, and when she broke down, the sentence folded into something smaller than grief, regret shaped like betrayal. My parents sat in the back row with their knuckles white, a mercy of quiet in a public space. People asked me if I regretted what I had set in motion. My honest answer was that the regret had many voices. I regretted the way everything about family became evidence. I grieved that the sister who braided my hair could be so ruthless with the currency of love. But I did not regret the necessity. There were nights I lay awake imagining Lena on the other side, frightened, ashamed, maybe finally meeting a version of herself she had avoided with theater and lies. Vengeance, in the legal world, had become paperwork and depositions. And in the spaces between I worked shifts and held hands and learned to be small again. Small in the way that healing sometimes asks you to be: available, patient, unglamorous. Then, in an unexpected turn, Lena's defense produced a packet of letters claiming childhood trauma, a litany of need and neglect that read like a map for empathy. The prosecutor, a woman who had once been my mentor, told me in a hallway that human beings are complicated. that guilt and victimhood can wear the same face, and that the court's job was to weigh harm against intention. I appreciated that there are no simple musicals where the justice system sings a triumphant finale. Real life is a duet of damage and circumstance. Still, I felt a quiet fury at the notion that pain justifies premeditated harm. The trial's closing arguments felt like a knife flaying the last of my illusions. The defense asked for mercy because Lena had needed validation, and my parents, who had sat through months of humiliation and loss, stood and spoke not with vengeance but with something tougher: steadfastness. My mother read a short statement about promises kept and promises sold, and when she finished there was no theatrical collapse, only a long exhale that seemed to travel through the courtroom and settle on everyone present. The jury returned a verdict that did not make a headline but made a mark. Guilty on several counts, the judge handing down restitution orders and a sentence that would include community service and mandated counseling, an attempt to thread accountability with rehabilitation. Lena's face as the gavel fell was unreadable. She looked as if the world had finally removed the stage and she had to stand in plain light. After the trial, she sent a letter that began with apology and ended with an odd, plaintive request for us to fix things quietly. I folded it and put it in a box of other artifacts: voicemails, bank statements, photos. Things that had once been instruments of her design and had become, instead, the proof of a life undone. Even as the legal chapter closed, the emotional one remained open. Our parents rebuilt, slowly, taking strange pride in small victories like a paid-off card or a sleepier night. Strangers I'd helped with documentation wrote me emails of thanks. And Lena, when she visited the small-town clinic where she was required to do community service, looked at me once across a crowded volunteer room, eyes wet but clear in a way I had not seen in years. There was no reconciliation in that look, only recognition of two people who had been braided together and then unspooled. I keep my days full because emptiness gives betrayal room to echo, but sometimes, in the quiet after a long shift, I take out her last letter and read the apology she finally managed to write without performative flourish. And I feel the complicated mix of sorrow and relief that forms the backbone of revenge when it ends not in triumph, but in the slow, stubborn return of ordinary life. In the months after the verdict, life didn't snap back so much as slowly uncoil, like a bandage you finally trust yourself to remove, and I kept waiting for the aching space where Lena used to live to fill with something cleaner than fury. It did, but not because time is merciful. It was because I chose to aim the wound at something useful. The hospital asked me to lead a pilot we called the Patient Integrity Program, dry words for a fierce little firewall, and I poured everything I had learned from Lena's playbook into it. Flag spikes in compassion donations, cross-check diagnoses with telemetry rather than theatrics, build a quiet referral path to social workers who can funnel real money to real need without letting a performer hold the microphone. We trained night shift clerks to spot the drama curve, that precise timing when pity peaks and bank accounts empty. We ask doctors to double verify compassionate use orders that arrive wrapped in urgency but unmoored from facts. I kept my tone clinical and my purpose personal. Restitution trickled in like an apology that refuses to be loud. Our parents replaced the front porch our father had left to rot while he was busy selling pieces of his future to fund a fiction, and the sound of his hammer on wood felt like a benediction. On the day the last of the credit alerts turned silent, my mother stood in the kitchen holding a receipt for a balance paid in full and cried without hiding it from me, and it felt like we had stolen something back from the mouth of a storm. Meanwhile, Lena wore her sentence like a costume she couldn't quite make fit. Community service has a way of stripping glamour. The small-town clinic was fluorescent and honest, and she was assigned to sit with intake forms and stack donated clothes and say thank you without expecting applause. At first, she tried to soften her edges for volunteers who didn't know the story. I watched from across the room on the days our shifts overlapped, not to torment her, but because vigilance had become part of my muscle memory. And when she realized she couldn't out-charm paperwork, something in her posture changed. She still sent the occasional letter, apologies braided with nostalgia, but I learned to read them like I read a chart. Separate symptom from signal. warmth from manipulation, hope from strategy. Forgiveness, if it came, would not arrive because she asked for it in cursive. The final turn began the way all her schemes had, with a soft light and a new name. A friend forwarded me a link to a live stream pitched as a healing circle for the invisibly ill, hosted by a woman with a blurred face and a familiar cadence, promising curated updates and private support for those who felt misunderstood by the medical system. It wasn't technically fundraising, at least not at first glance. It was energy work, retreat deposits, access tiers. But anyone who's ever watched a con knows when the hat is about to be passed. My breath came short and then steadied, because this was the place where the story either curdled into a sequel or ended with a click. I pulled Lena's probation terms from a folder I kept as neat as an OR tray. No fundraising activities related to medical claims. No misrepresentation of medical need. No contact with identified victims. The stream's chat was a collage of vulnerable hope, the exact audience Lena had always mined. I didn't post, didn't rage, didn't call her. I emailed the link to her probation officer and to the detective with a subject line that was all bones, potential violation, and attached screen recordings, timestamps, and a transcript where her co-host called her by an old alias she'd used when she was too sick to pick up a prescription she never took. The shutdown wasn't cinematic. There was no siren. It was a quiet administrative guillotine, a compliance takedown request, a platform's automated email, a phone call that lasted 6 minutes, and a follow-up visit that reminded her that consequences aren't a season, they're a structure. The stream vanished mid-sentence. The chat froze on a half-completed heart emoji. People who had hovered over the donate button received a platform notice that the event had been removed for violating terms. I sat at my desk and watched the cursor blink and felt a wave of relief heavy enough to make me dizzy. This, I thought, is revenge at its cleanest, not a public spectacle. Not a viral clapback, but the perfectly placed stop sign that keeps a car from barreling into a crosswalk full of people who trusted the signal. She called me that night from a number I didn't recognize, the voice small and almost childlike until it hit the point where it always sharpened. "You humiliated me," she said, and I said no, I didn't. I prevented you. I told her I would no longer be the archivist of her apologies, that if she wanted to build a life she wasn't lying to, she could start by writing to every donor she had ever courted and telling them, plainly, what she did and what she was doing to repair it. Not a statement, not a post. Letters, hand-signed, the kind that can't be forwarded without your shame attached. She swore, then she cried, then she hung up. A week later, a box arrived at my parents' door stamped with her hesitant handwriting. Inside were copies of the letters she had sent, the ink blotchy in places where the point pressed too hard. Some were returned to sender. Some had notes scribbled back, anger, blessing, both. A few included photocopied checks for $5 and $10 with careful memo lines that read, "For others who need help." My mother sat on the couch reading them out loud until her voice wore thin. And when she finished, she didn't say "I forgive her," and she didn't say "I never will." She said, "We are done paying," and in our house that sentence felt like a sacrament. The hospital's pilot went permanent. Other floors adopted our protocols. We watched, with the grim pride of people who built something out of bad luck, as a handful of would-be Lenas hit a net and didn't get to turn heartbreak into a business plan. As for my sister, the world did what it always does after the noise dies down. It offered her the small, unglamorous chance to do her hours, go to her therapy, show up where she said she would with nothing up her sleeve. Occasionally, I saw her on the bus or in line at the pharmacy, face unadorned, and our eyes would meet without theatrics. Once she approached me in the hospital lobby and asked, ordinary as a grocery list, how our father's porch was holding up. I told her it was sturdy. She nodded, and it felt less like a peace treaty than the absence of war. People think revenge ends with a gavel or a viral takedown. What they don't talk about is how it lives afterward. How it asks you every day whether you'll keep choosing boundaries over blood sugar highs of outrage. I still carry the box of artifacts, the forged statements, the screenshots, the letter that smelled like regret. And sometimes I bring it down and touch the paper as if to confirm that the past really happened. But the most satisfying piece of payback is not in that box at all. It's the email I get each quarter with a simple line item: restitution received, applied to patient relief fund. Money that once fed a lie now buys gas cards and copays and childcare for people who are quietly doing battle with illnesses that don't need a stage to be real. It's my father sitting on the new porch sipping coffee, shoulders lifted from his ears for the first time in years. It's my mother, finally sleeping through, not because she's forgotten, but because truth is a thicker blanket than fiction when you stop trying to tuck in the parts that won't stay. And if you're still waiting for the cinematic end, fine, here it is. Last month, I was paged to the clinic where Lena completes her service hours. A patient had fainted in the waiting room, and when I knelt and looked up for gauze and water, it was Lena's hands that were there, silent and steady. She didn't look at me for approval. I didn't look at her for apology. We worked. The patient came around. I told Lena to log the incident, and she did correctly, no flourish. That's the kind of vengeance I can live with. Not her destruction, but the defanging of her myth, the rerouting of her talent for performance into something that requires showing up with clean hands. If you're listening to this and your own story is shivering in your chest, know this: justice isn't always loud, but when you build it brick by brick, it holds. And sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't what you take. It's what you refuse to give ever again. The oxygen that lets a lie keep breathing.